Yo, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the JT Sports Podcast. I'm your host, JT. I want to once again talk about Georgia Tech's shocking upset over Florida State. Is Georgia Tech actually good, or is Florida State trash? I think both can be true in some capacity. Before this game got played, Nick Saban said that Georgia Tech was the biggest sleeper team in the ACC, and I was a little bit shocked at these statements. But once I started to think about it, Georgia Tech were turning over 80% of their production on offense from last year this season. You also have Brent Key, who is a Nick Saban disciple. He comes from Saban's coaching tree, and we know that if you hire a Nick Saban assistant, more times than not, they end up working out. So it's fair to expect Georgia Tech, with the amount of experience that they have on offense. You know that Haynes King can ball. You got some good receivers, a good running back, and experience proven offensive line. As long as their defense continues to play the way that they did against Florida State for the entirety of this year, I can definitely see Georgia Tech being a 8, potentially 9-win team if everything goes right for them this year. The ACC is not that strong, and with Haynes King having nearly 40 touchdowns last year, if he can do a better job of taking care of the football, Georgia Tech, there's not too many games that I can see them losing. And the biggest thing that hurt them last year was Haynes King's turnovers. He had 16 interceptions, and their defense couldn't stop anybody. They couldn't stop the run. They couldn't stop the pass. Well, those liabilities that they had last year, they corrected them in the offseason. Haynes King didn't have any turnovers against Florida State, although he had a couple of mishaps, but that's what you can expect when it's this early into the season. You're going to have a couple of turnover bugs and maybe some penalty issues early on, but as you progress throughout the season, those end up improving. And Georgia Tech, with their new defensive coordinator, looking like a home run hire for them, this is definitely a quality team that Florida State ran into. And I don't think Florida State is going to be garbage this year. I see them being a 9-3 team. The problem is that the expectations for Florida State this year were mostly based off what they did last year and not based off the team that they had coming into this season. I heard a lot of folks in the media make the excuse for all of the talent Florida State lost to the NFL, losing guys like Johnny Wilson, Keon Coleman, Jared Verse, and them saying that you can trust Mike Norvell and the infrastructure that he's built at Florida State, that they're going to be able to overcome those losses because they're so good at player development. And I believe that Mike Norvell is a really good coach, and he's building Florida State up to be a great program. But the issue that was heavily overlooked by many of you guys is that Florida State hasn't recruited at the level that you need to sustain always being a 11, 12-win team every year. You have to recruit at a top 5, top 10 level consistently, and FSU hasn't done that under Mike Norvell. Another issue that the Seminoles have is that you severely downgraded at quarterback. DJU isn't trash, but he's not good neither. He's really inconsistent. You got somebody that has all the physical traits to be the best quarterback in college football potentially, but he doesn't have the accuracy nor the consistent decision making to be dependable, especially in games like Florida State just lost to Georgia Tech, where you can trust them to carry the team to a win if you don't have the run game at your disposal. And the key for Florida State being able to have a great season like they did last year is being able to rely on their defense and have a dominant rushing attack. Well, you saw after their first drive, when Georgia Tech pretty much went all in on stopping the ground game, they became one-dimensional, and they had to rely on DJU to win them the game. And with Georgia Tech, they showed how Florida State doesn't have a lot of trust in DJ Uiagalelei at quarterback, because look at Florida State's strategy during that game. There was a point when DJU had negative 0.1 air yards. They were scared and petrified to ask this dude to push the football downfield despite how strong of an arm he has. So the fact that Georgia Tech exposed the lack of faith and trust that Mike Norvell and that FSU coaching staff have in DJU shows you the biggest problem with this team. You don't have reliable passing attack. And it's not all on DJU. You also are not that deep or talented at receiver. Guys were struggling to get off the line and create separation against Georgia Tech. So this is an offense that pretty much is going to be heavily dependent on having a great rushing attack, which definitely should happen because they're 3-4 deep at running back. Florida State recruits and develops running back better than the majority of teams in college football. But what's going to hurt them is when they get into games where they need to throw the football through the air to win. And that defense, I don't think they're going to be as bad this season as what we saw week 0 against GT. But you definitely can tell that they lost a lot of studs. Jared Verse, Brandon Fisk, those guys are gone, and they were hurting without them against Georgia Tech because they were getting bullied up front. And I wasn't surprised that Florida State lost to Georgia Tech. I was surprised by the fashion that they lost in. I wasn't expecting Georgia Tech's offensive line to just push around Florida State's front seven all game long, but that's what happened. Not only that, but from how that game went, you would have thought that Georgia Tech was the team that recruited better athletes and got better players from the transfer portal. This is one of those years for FSU where they had to rebuild. They're not Alabama or Georgia or Ohio State when they simply can reload, because you got to recruit at a certain level to be able to say, you know what, we don't rebuild, we just reload, and FSU hasn't done that. And when you mainly build your roster through the transfer portal, you set yourself up from seasons like this. Think about all the teams that went heavy in the portal. Lincoln Riley, his first year at USC, that was a portal-heavy team. They won 11 games that year. Look what happened after. They fell off and only won 7. Think about Michigan State. That year that they won that New Year's Six bowl game with Mel Tucker, once a lot of those portal guys that they got from that team left, like Kenneth Walker to the NFL, Mel Tucker got fired and Michigan State fell off the map right after that. So when you recruit through the portal, yeah, it's good for having a big lightning in a bottle season, but you don't see that carry over for the following year because you got to retool and rebuild all over again. And for Mike Norvell, until Florida State starts recruiting at a better level, you're not consistently going to be a 10 plus 11 win team year after year. You set yourself up for seasons like this where you may end up failing to live up to expectations, even though the expectations should have never been that high at all. I'm pretty confident that Mike Norvell and that staff knew that this team wasn't nowhere as good as what they had last year. But the media focuses too much on the recency bias instead of evaluating and judging teams for what they are at that moment. It's the same thing with Missouri. People swear that Missouri could win the SEC this year and be in the playoffs, but I see Missouri suffering the same fate that Florida State's going to suffer this year. They got to rebuild too. They do return their entire offense pretty much from last year. They only lose one starter, but they lose their defensive coordinator and the majority of their defense, and they don't recruit at a consistent enough level to sustain the kind of season that they had. That was one of the best seasons in Missouri football history. Last year was the best season Florida State football has had since the Jameis Winston and Jimbo Fisher era. So it was fair to expect a decline out of FSU this year, which is why I wasn't shocked at Georgia Tech pulling off the upset. That's why I took Georgia Tech plus 14.5 when it came out a few weeks ago. I knew that Georgia Tech had a great chance of pulling off the win because this Florida State team is not as good this year as what they were last year. And it shouldn't be surprising when you think about how much they lost to the NFL. So is Georgia Tech a good team? I really think they are. You got Brent Key, Nick Saban disciple. This was somebody who was brought in to be the interim head coach when they fired their previous head coach. And a lot of players inside of that program went to bat for this dude being the head coach. These guys have bought into what Brent Key is selling at Georgia Tech, and it's evident with the level of passion and enthusiasm that they played under him that we saw against FSU. I mean, this team was laying it all on the field. And for Mike Norvell and the Seminoles, I don't think you're trash, but you're definitely not as good as what your top 10 rankings suggested. And you're going to be in for a little bit of a rebuild season. DJU, with the kind of QB that he is, he's not going to lose you games outright, but he's going to have you in a lot of tightly contested games that are going to come down to the wire, where you're going to have to cross your fingers that he can make a couple of big throws late in the game, like how we saw him do in his final drive against GT. He was really clutch, especially on those 2 fourth down conversions. But you're going to have some games where he doesn't deliver late, and it's going to cost you. So every game that Florida State plays, when they go up against a quality team like SMU or Miami, you have a very high chance of losing those games because DJU is just so inconsistent. And unless you can be dominant running the football, and when I mean dominant running the football, it's a difference between being a great running team and being a dominant running team, because dominant running teams can run the football even when the opposing team knows that they want to run it. With Michigan last year, you knew they were going to run the football. You were putting 9 guys in the box and you still couldn't stop it. That's how you know you got a dominant rushing attack. You want to be able to run the football when the other team knows you want to run it. That shows the level of dominance you have with your rushing attack. In Florida State, they got a good rushing attack, but this isn't the kind of ground game that's going to be able to help them replicate the success they had last season if you don't have complementary quarterback play to go along with it. So I'm not surprised FSU lost. I do feel Georgia Tech is going to be a good team. Could they win the ACC? I'm not going to go that far, but this is definitely a more improved GT team than what we saw last year. And what isn't being talked about enough is, Georgia Tech went bowling last year. They beat UCF in their bowl game. This was a 7-win team in 2023, and the only thing that held them back was Haynes King's 16 interceptions and the fact that their defense couldn't stop anybody. It looks like they got both of those issues fixed, so it's fair to see them having a big season when they go 9 wins or they have a 9-win record. But let me know what you guys think about this. Is Georgia Tech good or is Florida State bad? Like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Remember that we aren't just a YouTube channel, we are a podcast. You can find this episode and all of our previous ones on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast from. The JT Sports Podcast is available. If you got any questions that you would like answered, you can send them in the DMs on Instagram at JT_Sports_ and on X at JT_Sports__. I appreciate you guys for tuning in. Give us a 5-star review if you enjoy, and I will see you guys shortly with another episode.